Hey everyone. So the reproductive morphology of plants we're talking about here really is what I'm going to be covering are the sexual reproductive morphology, which basically involves the flowers and the fruits, and the larger inflorescence that includes all the flowers of a flowering shoot. So these are traits, the traits associated with reproductive morphology, as Susan just mentioned, can be really critical for plant identification. In part, that's because the reproductive morphology is so important in the association of plants with other organisms, for example, pollinators or seed dispersal agents. And those relationships, in part coevolutionary relationships, really have resulted in a lot of change in plants, and in part have driven evolutionary divergence and even speciation. So it's not too surprising that the reproductive parts play a really key role in distinguishing between different species. So we're going to start out by talking about flowers. And to think about after what you just heard about vegetative morphology, as Susan mentioned, the shoot, the above ground parts of the plant are the leaves and the stems, basically those two organs. And a flower is basically just a modified shoot. And we know this from morphological, anatomical, developmental, genetic studies, that when you look at a typical flower, like in this drawing, what we're really seeing here, the stalk of the flower is a stem. And in this particular shoot, we just have 4 sets of leaves, and the stem terminates in the 4th set, the terminal-most set of parts. So flowers are a little unusual in that they don't retain the ability to keep growing as a shoot, and they have 4 separate sets of parts in a typical flower that are quite differentiated in function and in morphology. So the outermost part of a flower we call the sepals in most plants, the outermost whorl, that these are whorled parts. So as remember, Susan mentioned that whorls are sets of 3 or more leaves at a node. And in most flowers, we have 3 or more parts in each of these 4 sets of floral parts. So there are usually 3 or more sepals in flowers. And the sepals serve a protective function for the rest of the flower, especially when the flower is in bud. They enclose the rest of the flower and protect it. And they often have glands on the outside or structures that can help to thwart herbivores that might be interested in eating the flower. And they often look the most leaf-like of all the parts of the flower. The petals are the other, what we'd call sterile appendages of a flower. So these are the sepals and petals taken together, are the outermost 2 whorls of the flower, and they don't bear either pollen or ovules. So the petals serve typically a different function than the sepals, not always, but they often are involved in advertisement of the flower to pollinators, especially, this only really is true in animal pollinated flowers. But the petals are often brightly colored, as you're no doubt aware, and they might have guidelines or various features that help to orient the pollinator visually toward the business parts of the flower, the fertile appendages of the flower. And the outermost whorl of fertile appendages of the flower, just to the inside of the petals, or more toward the tip of the flower, are the stamens. And these, of course, are where pollen is born. And the central part of the flower, the tip of the flower, the last of the 4 whorls of parts, are the carpels that bear the ovules inside. So the term angiosperm literally means container seed. And the thing that sets the flowering plants, which are the angiosperms, apart from all the other plants, is that they're seeds. These are seed plants, but there are other seed plants like conifers and other gymnosperms. But these seed plants have their immature seeds and their seeds contained within an ovary. basically a leaf that's been fused along its outer margins into a container, a sealed container that helps to protect the immature and the mature seeds and is involved in the dispersal of the mature seeds. So here are the 4 sets of parts again: the sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels as we go from the base of the flower toward the tip. And so there's some other terminology that's really important to learn associated with these 4 sets of parts in the overall flower. The stalk of an individual flower, the stem I talked about, is called a pedicel. So a pedicel is just the stalk of an individual flower. Receptacle is the name of the base of the flower. So the very base of the flower where all the parts of the flower are attached. And then the sepals taken together collectively go by the name calyx, C-A-L-Y-X. And this term is especially used if the sepals are fused together into a common structure, but it applies regardless for all the sepals taken together. And then the petals taken together collectively, all of them in an individual flower, are called the corolla. And then the petals and sepals all taken together, that is all these sterile appendages of the flower, the petals and sepals, are collectively called the perianth. And some people refer to if the parts all look the same, the petals and sepals all look the same, the perianth is often referred to as tepals, T-E-P-A-L-S, but we don't use that term in the Jepson resources. But if you ever encounter it, that's what that means. And then with regard to the fertile appendages of the flower, the stamen is typically broken up into 2 major parts. There's a long, thin stalk, and this stalk is called the filament. And then at the tip of the filament, we have the anther, which is the portion that bears the pollen. So each anther in most plants has 2 anther sacs that are attached here. And within each one of those anther sacs, there are 2 sporangia where pollen is produced. And pollen is the dispersal represents the unit of dispersal for the little male organisms that the flower produces that produce sperm and that are transferred in a flowering plant to the stigma, hopefully of another flower rather than the same flower, but most plants are bisexual or have hermaphroditic with both stamens and carpels in the same flower. But in that case, there's usually mechanisms that tend to limit the amount of selfing, since selfing represents inbreeding and has bad genetic consequences in the long run, evolutionarily at least, and potentially in the near term in terms of fitness of individual progeny. And so we tend to get transferred to another plant, stigma. And so if we look at the anthers taken together, the stamens collectively, all the stamens of a flower, they're collectively called the andrecium. And in the case of the carpels, all of those taken together are collectively called the gynoecium. So this just refers to the male parts and the female parts of the flower. Now, an individual structure here, like we see in this gynoecium, with a stigma where pollen germinates, with a style through which the pollen tubes grow down to reach the ovules, inside the ovary, which is this chamber that contains the ovules, which are immature seeds. The pollen tubes grow into those ovules and release their sperm, and the sperm fertilizes the eggs inside the small female organisms that live inside the ovules. This entire structure with a stigma, style, and ovary is called a pistil. And a pistil can represent a single carpel. A carpel is just the leaf, the modified leaf that's basically sealed along its margins to contain the ovules. But multiple carpels, or these modified leaves, can actually fuse together into a common structure that represents a pistil. So a pistil might be the same as a carpel in an instance where we have only one carpel per flower, or we might have multiple carpels per flower, but they're all free from one another. In those cases, a pistil equals a carpel, but sometimes the carpels are fused together into a common structure that looks like this, in which case the pistil is composed of multiple carpels. And we'll look at that again in a moment. Just to let you know that carpel and pistil are not homologous, are not identical terms. They're not completely synonymous in all cases. All right, so as Susan mentioned briefly, there are two major groups of flowering plants, two major evolutionary groups, and they represent the vast majority of flowering plants. And in California, that's especially true. We don't have very many other species of flowering plants except representatives of these two groups, the monocots and the eudicots. And this ending cot refers to cotyledons, which are embryonic leaves. And if you look at the embryos inside seeds, in a monocot, they only have one cotyledon, one embryonic leaf, whereas eudicots have two embryonic leaves. But that's not an easy character to visualize. You can also tell these groups apart by their root systems and their conducting tissue, the vascular tissue in their stems, the pattern in which those are organized. But the main features you're going to look to are the leaves. So the leaf venation patterns are net-like, this reticulate pattern Susan mentioned in eudicots, whereas in monocots, you typically get this parallel venation of the leaves. But in terms of reproductive parts, which we're talking about now, the main thing to look for is the number of parts in each one of each one of the sets of parts of the flower. So here you can see 3 sepals and 3 petals. And that's true of monocots. They have their parts in multiples of 3s typically, whereas eudicots have their parts in multiples of 4 or 5. And here you can see a monocot, an iris, with its parts in 3s here. And here you can see a flannel bush, Fremonodendron, with its parts in 5s. So that's an important distinction. And it holds up reasonably well. There are exceptions. There's some eudicots with their parts in 3s, for example, and vice versa, monocots with parts of 4, but it's not common at all. All right, so corolla symmetry and symmetry of the flower in general is another feature that's really important. So most plants have, flowering plants have their flowers organized in a way that has radial symmetry, like you see in this nightshade, where you can cut the flower down the middle in one of multiple planes and get 2 equal halves, like a starfish. Whereas quite a few, and especially some of the plants that have more specialized pollination syndromes, have bilateral symmetry of their flowers. That is where we can only cut the flower in one plane, as you see here, to yield 2 equal halves, like our own bodies are organized. Very rarely are flowers asymmetric, like you see here, where there's no plane of symmetry. And also rarely do we see biradial symmetry like this, where you can only cut the flower in 2 planes to get equal halves. But something like the dicentra here, which is in our California flora, has this kind of symmetry. All right, so another important feature to think about is whether or not the parts are fused to one another. And this fusion can be manifested in a couple of different ways. One way in which fusion occurs is fusion between like parts. So the petals or the sepals, they can be free, not fused to one another, as you see here in this rose and buttercup. Or we can have the petals fused to one another, as you see in this morning glory flower. Or the sepals could be fused to one another, as we see in lots of members of the carnation family, like this one. And we call that conation, but that term is not used in the Jepson manual. So it's more of a point that I want to make just in terms of how fusion can occur. And again, we can have fusion of different kinds of parts between the different whorls of the flower. So here we can see a really common type of adnation, as it's called, fused between unlike parts, where we have the stamens fused to the inner surface of the petals. And this generally happens when the petals themselves are fused to one another. And you can see a longitudinal section of this drawing of the stamens fused to the inside of the petals. We call these stamens in this condition Epipetalous. So they're on the outside of they appear to be emerging from, rather than from the base of the flower, they appear to be emerging from the surface of the petal, the inner surface, thus Epipetalous. There are a number of corolla shapes that for which there's terminology and that have arisen enough times to make it worthwhile to have terminology for these shapes. And even though these terms are usually applied to corollas, sometimes they apply to calyces as well, to the calyx. But in any case, here you can see the common condition of having a two-lipped flower. This is what we see in plants with bilateral symmetry many times of the flower, where you can cut the flower in one plane to get equal halves, where there's an upper lip and a lower lip. And we call these two-lipped. You might see the term bilabiate as well to refer to the two lips here. And each one of these lips often has multiple lobes representing different petals. Of the shape, in terms of shape of the corolla, there are a number of terms that are important. Jepson uses fairly simple language for this. So a bell-shaped corolla looks just like it sounds here. And sometimes that we have petals fused quite far close to the tip, but sometimes they can be nearly just fused at the base, for example, in a bell-shaped flower. Rotate is a term that's not as obvious, but what that means is that the lobes flare widely of the corolla, and there's a very short tube. So this is a term for in the case of a plant with fused petals, we have a very short tube at the base where the parts are fused together, and then we have a widely spreading lobes. And the term limb is used for the parts of the flower that spread or that are not that are part of this expanded structure here. So baby blue eyes, Nemophila menziesii is a great example of a rotate corolla, very short tube united at the base and a widely spreading limb, where you can see the lobes here. Urn-shaped is also like it sounds, where widest at the base, fused all the way close to the tip, and narrowest right before the tip. And a manzanita flower is a great example of this, as you see here. So it's shaped like an urn. We don't use the term urceolate in the Jepson glossary, but you will find that term used for that shape. And then petals sometimes have a narrow basal region and an expanded apical region, distal region, in which case the basal region is often referred to as a claw, and the tip is referred to as the limb, the expanded part. And that term I was using up here as well for the expanded part of the corolla. Similar to rotate is the term salverform. And this has a widely spreading limb here where the lobes are widely spreading. And there's a tube, but in this case, the tube is long and slender. And a great example of this is a snowberry like Symphora carpus species shown here. And as Stacy mentioned in the intro slides, when she showed an Aquilegia or columbine flower here, some flowers have spurs. And here in the Aquilegia, you can see a spur as columbine. And spurs are places where nectar collects. And here you can see drawings of spurs of the calyx in the case of a garden nasturtium, Metropiolum, and a spur of a corolla is a common feature. We've seen a lot of different species. So the spurs have evolved from different structures in flowering plants, but they share the feature of collecting nectar. So these are places where nectar rewards are stored for pollinators that sit in a position where they're filled by nectaries, which are generally located at the base of flowers. And I want to turn now to some features of the gynoecium in particular. Remember, the gynoecium represent all of the ovule-bearing structures of the flower. Remember, in botany, ovules represent immature seeds. Inside of the ovule, there is an egg, but it's just one of the cells of this larger structure. The terms ovule is used differently in zoology or in human biology, but ovule is just an immature seed. And the gynoecium represents all of the ovule-bearing structures of an individual flower. And each one of those structures is called a pistil, again, with a stigma, style, and ovary. And there might be one pistil in an individual flower, or there might be multiple pistils. If there are multiple pistils in an individual flower, like you see in this buttercup, a little hard to see, but they're flattened structures with a little hook-like style with stigma, and this flattened ovary here, large number of them here. If there's more than one pistil, then each one of those pistils represents an individual carpel or modified leaf that contains one or more ovules, only one in the case of a buttercup. But if there's only one pistil inside of a flower, that might represent more than one carpel that could be fused together into a common pistil, this unit with a single ovary typically. And here you can see a great example where this is a hypothetical evolutionary transition from a plant that had 3 pistils in its flower that were all free from one another, representing free carpels, as they always do. There are multiple pistils, each one's an individual carpel. Here you can see cross-section through the ovary, where these are the ovules, immature seeds, attached by a placenta, and that's the ovary wall. So you can see they're free from each other. But in evolutionary time, these may become fused into a common structure. And if that happens, just by looking at the outside of the pistil, you can sometimes tell if there's more than one carpel, because there'll be, so a lot of times it'd be more than one style. And the number of styles would equate to the number of carpels, typically, the number of leaves that were fused together to form that structure. And if you make a cross-section of that ovary, you oftentimes can tell based on the placentation, and in some cases like this, the number of chambers of the ovary, how many carpels went into that. So in this instance, if you started with this situation, you can imagine these 3 fusing together to give you these 3 locules, 3 chambers. The locule is the chamber of the ovary that make up this compound pistil. A compound pistil is one that's made up of more than one carpel. I realize that's a little confusing and it's worth studying, but that terminology is worth learning because it's important many times how many carpels are in a particular pistil if you have only one in a particular plant group. And ways you can also look at this, these cross sections of ovaries can be really helpful to make, but you're going to really need to use a hand lens to look at this and make a really careful cross section, because oftentimes we're dealing with very small structures here to be able to make this out. But this is what we just looked at, where we have multiple chambers with the placenta or point of attachment of the ovules along the axis of the ovary, which is called axial placentation, when there are multiple chambers like this and the ovules are attached along the center. Or we can have parietal placentation, where there are multiple carpels fused together, but there's only one chamber or locule. But we see that there's more than one point along which ovules are attached to the inner wall of the ovary. And that's a dead giveaway that you're dealing with more than one carpel, in this case 3. Sometimes those placentae can be intruded a little bit, but still one chamber. This is what you'd see, say, in a buttercup if you make a cross section of the ovary where there's only one carpel per pistil, there's only one placenta where one or more ovules were attached. In the carnation or primrose family, there's only one chamber, but there's a central axis along which ovules are attached. This free central, it's free because it doesn't have septi or individual septa that unite it to the outer margin or inner wall of the ovary. So that's only seen in a limited number of families like carnation family and primrose family, but if you find it, it's really diagnostic. And then sometimes you can have apical placentation. This is looking in longitudinal section now. This is the base of the ovary, and the stigma up here can have apical placentation or basal placentation in some groups. So that can be really important for looking, but that's getting into more fine scale details of the flower. Okay, I think I have a little time here still to talk about some other ways in which parts of the flower can be fused in ways that can be taxonomically diagnostic and also ecologically important. So one is where we have adnation or fusion of unlike parts that encompasses the sepals, petals, and the stamens. So 3 of the 4 main whorls of the flower, three of the 4 whorls of the flower. And when this happens, we can have the generation of a hypanthium, which is basically another simple term for this is floral cup. The term hypanthium, though, is used in the Jepson e-flora glossary and Jepson manual glossary. And here you can see a longitudinal section of a flower where you can see that the bases of the sepals, petals, and stamens are fused together, and they form this cup within which the pistil appears to be sitting. And this cup collects nectar, and plants with these hypanthia, where you can see the sepals and petals and stamens diverge from the tip of this cup, and it can look like they arise from the edge of the cup, but in actuality, they arise from the base of the flower. It's just this portion from the base of the flower up to the rim of the hypanthium or floral cup. Those 3 sets of parts are fused together. And so this can contain nectar, and it's important because there are quite a few plant families and genera, major groups of flowering plants that have hypanthia. So hypanthium can be an important thing to diagnose. So you see here that the ovary is free, though. The ovary is not part of the hypanthium in this instance. But sometimes we can get fusion of the sepals, the bases of the sepals, petals, stamens, and ovary wall. And that's what I'm going to talk about now with regard to so-called ovary position. And this is an important concept here. So in a flower like we just looked at, where all the parts are free, or maybe the petals, sepals, and stamens are fused into a hypanthium, but we look in and we can see the ovary and the rest of the pistil appear to be sitting, or I should say the other parts of the flower seem to be arising from the base of the ovary. That's a situation where we call the ovary as being in a superior position, where it's free from the perianth stamens, such that perianth stamens appear to arise at its base. So superior because it appears to rise from the top of the flower, it's on top of the other parts. Whereas sometimes the bases of the perianth stamens are fused to the outer wall of the ovary. And in this case, it appears that the sepals, petals, and stamens arise from the tip of the ovary. And in this case, since the ovary looks like it's below the other flower parts, it's called inferior. So this happens, this has evolved many times in flowering plants. Inferior ovaries have evolved, but sometimes they can diagnose entire families or genera, groups of families. So it's an important feature to recognize. And sometimes there can be a hypanthium that extends above an inferior ovary, where only the perianth and the stamens are fused above that point, forming a floral cup. So I didn't want to lead you to the impression that a hypanthium is exclusive of having an inferior ovary, but the inferior ovary is the condition where the ovary wall also has perianth and staminal tissue fused around it. And so this can evolve by providing some additional protection to the ovary from herbivores and seed predators in particular. All right, so finally, I want to talk about sexual expression within flowers. And so as we talked about in the first set of slides, most flowering plants have perfect flowers. And perfect just means that both functional stamens and functional pistils are present within an individual flower. And that condition is often called bisexual or hermaphroditic. So that's the ancestral condition of flowering plants, and it's the most common condition. But if there's strong selection for outcrossing in a condition here where we could have the potential for selfing, and we'll talk about one circumstance in which that sort of thing, there's very strong selection along those lines that could lead to this condition. We can have imperfect flowers where only the stamens are functional or only the pistils are functional. Sometimes the other fertile appendages are present, but they're just not functional, or sometimes they're gone altogether. But we also refer to these as unisexual flowers. And if the flowers are unisexual in a given species, there's a couple of ways in which those flowers can be present on the plant. We can either have both types of unisexual flower on the same plant, but in which case they're usually in different positions on the plant, and they often mature at different times, which limits selfing, because even if you have unisexual flowers, if you have both types of flower on the same plant, selfing can still occur across different plants. It has the same genetic consequences of selfing. But this is going to make outcrossing more likely if you have unisexual flowers, even if both types are on the same individual. But in some plants like willows, you have staminate flowers on different plants than where the pistillate flowers are found, in which case we call that species dioecious, or that condition dioecious, in which case selfing is impossible and outcrossing is enforced, where you basically have male and female plants. So that's the two ways in which we can see these conditions manifested. Okay, so at this point, I think we have some time for questions, so please ask away.